the waitress who spoke with her hands the rain had been falling since dawn, the kind that coated the city in a shimmering veil and turned streetlights into tiny suns reflected on wet asphalt. Inside La Balera, a quiet Italian restaurant tucked between skyscrapers. The scent of roasted garlic and baked bread mingled with the murmur of dinner conversation. Waiters moved like clockwork, polished, efficient, anonymous. Among them was Alina Morales, a young woman whose quiet diligence had made her invisible to most patrons. She liked it that way. At 22, invisibility was safer than attention. Alina worked double shifts to pay for her degree in linguistics and social interpretation, a field that fascinated her because words alone had never been enough for her. From childhood, she'd loved the dance of gestures, the silent poetry of hands forming meaning. Her late grandmother had been deaf, and teaching Alina sign language had been their shared world, one that didn't require sound to feel full. Even now, years after her grandmother's passing, Alina carried that language like a secret melody in her veins. That evening, a whisper rippled through the restaurant, the sort of shift in atmosphere that only happens when someone powerful walks in. The mater d' straightened his tie.
Ow.
The manager appeared from the back with forced composure, and conversation dimmed just enough for anticipation to settle over the tables. Alina didn't need to ask who it was. She heard the soft shuffle of expensive shoes and the low hum of conversation trailing behind. Him Marco De Luca had arrived. Everyone in the city knew the name. Some spoke it with admiration, others with fear. He was young for the influence he carried, 35. Impeccably dressed, self-contained, and always surrounded by quiet men who rarely spoke, but saw everything. To most, he was the heir of the De Luca Enterprises, a vast network of real estate, shipping, and luxury ventures. But the streets told other stories of power built on shadows and debts. None of that mattered to Alina. She lived her life far from such circles. Still, when she saw him escorted to table 11, the one beneath the chandelier that reflected diamonds in every glass, her stomach tightened, because table 11 was hers. "Keep your head down, smile, and don't spill anything," whispered Maria, the senior waitress, sliding past her. "And whatever you do, don't look nervous. He notices everything." Alina forced a smile, balancing her tray as she approached. The woman seated beside Marco caught her attention first, a graceful lady in her 60s. Silver hair swept into a chignon, eyes bright but distant. There was something unusual about her composure, the way her gaze scanned the room without fully connecting. And then Alina understood the woman wasn't responding to the soft remarks of the man on her right. Her movements were careful, deliberate, tuned to sight more than sound. When Alina reached the table, she set the menus down and offered her usual greeting. "Good evening. May I get you something to drink?" Marco nodded politely, but said nothing. His focus was on his mother, who was looking up at Alina with a smile that didn't quite reach her ears. The older woman moved her hands gently, fingers tracing patterns in the air, hesitant but graceful. The gestures were unmistakable. She was signing. For a heartbeat, Alina froze. Then, instinct took over. She smiled warmly and let her hands answer. "Good evening," she signed, her fingers steady and sure. "It's an honor to serve you tonight." The woman's face lit up, as if the room itself had brightened. Her hands moved faster, joyous, fluid. "You sign. How wonderful. It's been years since someone spoke to me properly in a restaurant." Alina's heart swelled. She signed back quickly, explaining that her grandmother had been deaf, that she'd learned both ASL and Italian sign. The older woman, Lucia De Luca, laughed silently. A soundless ripple of delight expressed through her eyes and shoulders. They spoke with their hands for several minutes, Lucia complimenting the food, asking about Alina's studies, telling her about her garden on the outskirts of Florence. For once, Alina forgot about time, about caution, about the dozens of eyes around them. All she saw was this woman's happiness, the relief of being understood. When Alina finally excused herself, she turned to find Marco watching her not with irritation, but with something far more unreadable. His dark eyes held quiet surprise, as though a door he hadn't known existed had just opened in front of him. Later that night, when the rush had subsided and Alina was cleaning wine glasses, Marco approached the counter. His presence changed the air. Even the manager stepped aside. "My mother enjoyed your conversation," he said simply. His voice was deep calm with the faint trace of an Italian accent. "She hasn't smiled like that in months." Alina wiped her hands on her apron, suddenly aware of how plain she must look beside him. "She's a lovely woman." "It was my pleasure, sir." He studied her for a moment, as if memorizing her. "Most people pretend they don't understand when she tries to sign. You didn't pretend. You answered." Alina looked down. "Sometimes listening doesn't need ears." Marco's expression softened. A flicker of admiration passed across his face before he inclined his head slightly. "You're very perceptive, Miss Morales." "Alina Morales. Thank you, Miss Morales." He slipped a folded note beneath a tip receipt and left without another word. When Alina opened it later, she found not money, but a single line written in elegant handwriting: "Grazie per aver dato una voce." Thank you for giving her a voice. The next week, Alina couldn't shake the memory of that evening. Every clink of silverware reminded her of Lucia's laughter. Every reflection of city lights and puddles felt like a fragment of that moment when she'd forgotten the walls around her. She told herself it was foolish men like Marco De Luca lived in worlds of power and distance. Yet part of her couldn't help imagining what it must be like to belong to a family that carried such contrast. One rooted in silence and one surrounded by whispers of danger. On Friday, a courier delivered a letter to the restaurant addressed to her. Inside was a formal note. "Miss Morales, my mother would like to invite you to a small private luncheon this Sunday at our residence. She wishes to continue your conversation. Respectfully, Marco de Luca." Alina's first instinct was to decline. She'd spent her life avoiding attention. But the thought of Lucia's smile, gentle, kind, genuine, made it impossible to refuse. She convinced herself that it was merely professional courtesy. Nothing more. Sunday arrived with sunlight streaming through clouds. The De Luca estate sat at the edge of the city, a mansion framed by gardens that smelled of lavender and lemon trees. When the gate opened, Alina's nervousness deepened. She had worn her best dress, simple, navy blue. Neat, but she still felt out of place among marble fountains and gleaming cars. Lucia greeted her personally, her delight obvious. Through sin, she expressed how grateful she was for Alina's visit. How lonely silence could be even in a house filled with people. Over coffee, they spoke for hours about travel, art, and language. Lucia's warmth erased Alina's anxiety. She almost forgot where she was until Marco entered the room. He wasn't wearing the sharp, business armor she'd seen at the restaurant. Instead, a white shirt with sleeves rolled back, a casual grace that startled her. "I see my mother's found a new favorite person," he said with a faint smile. Lucia signed something quickly, and Alina translated aloud. "She says you don't visit her enough." Marco laughed quietly. "Betrayed by my own mother." His gaze drifted back to Alina. "I'm glad you came." As the afternoon unfolded, Alina saw sides of the De Luca world that rumors never mentioned. Lucia's kindness was disarming. Her garden was filled with hand-carved benches made by local artisans she supported. Marco spoke of opening community centers in poorer districts, projects funded quietly, without headlines. The contrast between gossip and reality unsettled Alina's assumptions. When she rose to leave, Lucia clasped her hands. "Come back," she signed. "You bring light into this house." Marco escorted her to the gate. For a while, they walked in silence until he spoke. "You know, most people see power and assume darkness, but sometimes the things people call power are just protection." Lena glanced up at him. "Protection from what?" He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "From the loneliness that comes with it." Something in his tone, soft, unguarded, stirred a strange ache inside her. She wanted to ask more, but the driver opened the gate and the moment passed. Days turned into weeks. Lucia began visiting La Bellera regularly, always asking for Elena's section. Sometimes Marco accompanied her, sometimes not. When he did, he and Alina exchanged brief conversations that hovered between politeness and something deeper, moments charged with unspoken understanding. She discovered that he loved classical music despite his mother's deafness, that he collected old books, that he could quote Dante in the original Italian. In turn, he learned that she volunteered at a local language center for children with hearing impairments, teaching them to express their world through sin. What began as curiosity slowly turned into something Alina couldn't name. When she caught him watching her, the world narrowed to the space between their eyes. But she reminded herself of her boundaries. She was a waitress, and he was a man carved from another life entirely. One evening, after closing, she found Marco waiting by the restaurant's back entrance. The night air was cool, the city humming beyond the alleyway. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said softly. "I just wanted to thank you for what you've done for my mother. She talks about you constantly." Elena smiled nervously. "She's the one who deserves thanks. She makes everyone feel at home." Marco stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "You make her feel seen. That's rarer than you think." He paused, then added, "I owe you a favor." She shook her head. "I don't want favors." "Then a promise?" he countered. "If you ever need help of any kind, call me." There was sincerity in his eyes that disarmed her. "Why would I ever need your help?" "Because the world isn't always kind to people like you, those who see goodness in everyone." His voice dropped to a murmur. "People will take advantage of that." She wanted to protest, but the concern in his tone silenced her. When he left, she stood beneath a streetlight for a long time, her heart restless. 2 months later, fate tested that promise. Alina returned home one night to find her apartment complex surrounded by flashing lights. A fire had broken out on the floor below hers. The damage to her unit was minimal, but the smoke had destroyed most of her belongings. She found herself standing in the street, clutching a single bag, trembling. Without thinking, she dialed the number Marco had written on the back of that first note. He arrived within 20 minutes. No entourage, no pretense, just concern etched across his face. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, tears finally escaping. "I don't have anywhere to go tonight." "Then you'll stay at our guest house," he said firmly. When she began to protest, he cut her off. "Please. My mother will never forgive me if I don't." That night, Alina slept in a room overlooking Lucia's garden, surrounded by quiet luxury she didn't belong to. Yet what comforted her most was the soundlessness of it all, the kind of peace that felt like safety. In the morning, Lucia brought her breakfast herself, signing with a mischievous grin that she finally had someone to share her morning coffee with. For the next week, Alina remained there helping Lucia in the garden, teaching her new signs, laughing more than she had in years. Marco often joined them after work, their conversations growing easier, warmer. He spoke of his father's passing, of inheriting responsibilities he'd never asked for, of wanting to build something different, something cleaner. She listened, offering the quiet understanding that only someone outside his world could give. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the terrace gold, Lucia retired early, leaving them alone. Silence stretched between them until Marco finally said, "You've changed this house. My mother sleeps better. The staff smiles more. Even I find reasons to come home." Alina met his gaze, her pulse quickening. "Maybe you just needed to remember what home feels like." He stepped closer, the fading light catching in his eyes. "And what does it feel like to you, Alina?" "Like this," she whispered. "When people see you for who you are, instead of who they think you should be." He hesitated, as if fighting an impulse, then reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. "You shouldn't have to hide your kindness. It's your strength." Her breath caught, but before she could answer, a voice called from inside, breaking the moment. He stepped back, clearing his throat. "Come to dinner tomorrow. My mother insists." She smiled faintly. "Your mother or you?" He didn't answer, only smiled in return. That night, Alina lay awake listening to the soft rustle of leaves beyond the window. She thought about how life had changed in ways she could never have planned, from anonymity to connection, from silence to being heard. And beneath the gratitude was something deeper, something fragile but growing, hope. She didn't yet know that this hope would soon be tested in ways neither she nor Marco could foresee. That the very kindness which had drawn them together to become the force that would challenge everything surrounding them. But for now, as dawn crept over the horizon, Alina let herself dream of a world where love could speak in every language. Evan, the silent one. The language of hearts. The following weeks passed with the quiet rhythm of early summer. Sunlight spilling through the DeLuca garden and transforming Lucia's lavender rose into rivers of color. Alina had settled into a delicate balance between gratitude and uncertainty. She spent her mornings helping Lucia with her sign language practice, her afternoons volunteering at the community center, and her evenings occasionally sharing dinner with Marco and his mother in the glass-roofed conservatory that smelled faintly of basil and rosemary. Every dinner unfolded like a slow-moving current. Gentle conversations, laughter that needed no translation, and subtle glances that lingered longer than either dared to admit. Despite the warmth that had grown between them, Alina never forgot how different their worlds were. She had come from a modest neighborhood filled with second-hand dreams, while Marco belonged to a legacy built on polished marble and old money. Yet beneath his calm authority, she could see a man quietly rebelling against the weight of that legacy. He spoke rarely about his business, but when he did, his tone carried the fatigue of someone trying to rebuild something broken from within. One evening, after the last rays of sun had faded, Marco found her on the terrace watering Lucia's orchids. The city stretched below like a constellation of lights. "My mother tells me you've been teaching her how to sign stories," he said, leaning casually against the doorway. Alina smiled, still focused on the plants. "She's a natural storyteller. Yesterday she told me about your father proposing in Naples. She said he was so nervous he dropped the ring into a fountain." Marco laughed quietly, a sound she rarely heard. That sounds like him. He was clumsy with words, but generous with feelings. His gaze softened as he watched her tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "You have that same gift, speaking with feelings more than words." She set down the watering can, meeting his eyes. "It's easier when you've had to rely on expressions your whole life. Words can lie. Gestures don't." For a moment neither moved. The air between them felt charged, filled with everything unspoken. Then Marco took a slow breath. "You make things simple that I've spent years trying to understand." Lena looked away, her heart pounding. "And what's that?" He hesitated, his voice dropping low. "That peace doesn't come from power. It comes from people who remind you who you are when you forget." The honesty in his words both comforted and frightened her. She wanted to believe it, but part of her knew that peace and power rarely coexisted for long. She excused herself gently, not trusting the trembling in her chest, and left him standing there beneath the soft hum of city lights. A few days later, an unexpected visitor arrived at the DeLuca residence, a polished woman in a tailored navy suit, her posture sharp enough to cut glass. Alina recognized her immediately. Camilla Rossi, prominent lawyer often mentioned in the society pages as Marco's family counsel and once rumored companion. Camilla's presence carried a chill that no sunlight could warm. She greeted Lucia politely before turning her attention to Marco, who appeared uneasy. Lucia signed quietly. "Perhaps we should continue our lesson in the garden." But before Alina could move, Camilla's voice sliced through the air. "You must be the waitress my sources keep mentioning." Her smile was thin, practiced. Quite a leap from serving tables to living under the DeLuca roof. Elena stiffened, her instinct to disappear returning in full force. Marco's expression hardened. "Camilla, that's enough." The lawyer's eyes flickered with something sharper than jealousy, concern, perhaps, or calculation. "You're letting sentiment cloud your judgment, Marco. You know what people will say?" "I don't care what they say," he replied evenly. "You should," Camilla countered, lowering her voice. "Investors, partners, this family's name carries weight. You can't afford distractions." Her gaze lingered on Alina, cool and assessing. "Especially not ones the world won't understand." Alina could have defended herself, but she chose silence. Years of navigating pity and prejudice had taught her that dignity spoke louder than argument. Instead, she lifted her chin and said softly, "You don't need to understand me, ma'am. I'm not here for the world's approval." Then she turned to Lucia and signed, "Shall we continue?" Lucia's answering smile was proud, maternal. Marco watched the exchange in silence. something fierce and protective flickering in his eyes. After Camilla left, the evening felt heavy with unspoken things. Marco found Alina in the garden again, her hands still trembling from the encounter. "You handled that with more grace than I deserved," he said. Alina shook her head. "You don't owe me anything." "She's right, you know. I don't fit here." He stepped closer, his expression earnest. "Maybe that's why you belong here, because you remind this place what it means to feel." She looked up at him, searching his face. "And what does it mean to you?" His answer was almost a whisper. "It means hope." As summer deepened, their bond grew in quiet, undeniable ways. They shared evening walks along the river, discussing everything from language to philosophy. Sometimes he would ask her to teach him simple signs, fumbling through them with genuine effort until she laughed and corrected his hand positions. Those moments became their secret universe, unspoken, entirely theirs. But beyond their fragile cocoon, the world began to intrude. A newspaper article appeared one morning featuring a photo of Marco leaving Labella beside Alina. The headline hinted at scandal, twisting a story of kindness into rumor. Within hours, the mansion was buzzing with phone calls, whispers, and tension. Marco's board demanded explanations. Lucia, though serene, sensed the weight pressing on her son. That evening, Lena found him in his study, the light from his desk lamp carving shadows across his face. "You should have told me this would cause trouble," she said quietly. He looked up, weary but resolute. "You think I didn't know? I just hoped it wouldn't matter." "But it does," she said. "You have a life to protect. Your name, your company, your mother's peace." He stood abruptly, crossing the space between them. "And what about you, Alina? You've done nothing wrong. Why should you carry shame for something beautiful?" Her heart twisted. "Because the world doesn't see beauty the way we do, Marco. It sees boundaries, not bridges." He exhaled, frustration written across his features. Then maybe it's time someone tore those boundaries down. Before she could reply, Lucia entered the room, her expression calm yet knowing. She signed softly. "Love doesn't destroy reputations, my son. Fear does." Then she turned to Alina and took her hand. "You've given me back my voice. Don't let anyone take yours." The older woman's wisdom silenced them both. Weeks passed. The gossip slowly faded, replaced by newer scandals the city preferred to chase. Yet something inside Marco had shifted. He began to delegate more of his business affairs, focusing instead on community projects he and Alina had once discussed. Together they opened a small center that offered free sign language lessons and interpretation services. Lucia insisted on being their first student volunteer. On opening day, the local paper covered the story, calling it a bridge of silence and sound. For Alina, that moment was more than success, it was vindication. Standing beside Marco and Lucia as they cut the ribbon, she felt for the first time that her quiet world had a place in the larger one. Later that night, as the celebration faded and the guests dispersed, Marco found her on the balcony overlooking the city. It was cool, the hum of traffic distant. "When I first met you," he began, "I thought you were just another fleeting moment in a long list of polished evenings. But you turned out to be the one thing that made all of this mean something." Alina smiled softly. "I didn't change your life, Marco. You did that yourself." He shook his head, stepping closer. "No, you reminded me that strength isn't silence, it's honesty. You showed me that love can exist without control, that kindness can be powerful." His hand brushed hers, hesitant but certain. "You gave my mother her voice back. Maybe you can give me mine too." Now the words hung between them like a vow, quiet yet profound. For a heartbeat, time seemed to pause, the lights of the city fading, the air thick with something that felt like destiny. Then he leaned in, not with urgency, but reverence, and their lips met in a kiss that felt less like possession and more like understanding. It was the kind of kiss that didn't demand promises. It offered peace. Months later, Labella hosted a charity gala for the community center. The restaurant was filled with laughter, music, and the soft rhythm of hands signing across tables. Lucia, radiant in emerald silk, stood on the small stage and addressed the audience through Elena's interpretation. We built this place on the belief that silence is not emptiness. It is simply another form of music waiting to be heard. As the applause rose, Marco found Alina among the crowd, their eyes meeting across the room. In that shared glance, every hardship, every risk, every whispered doubt found its resolution. After the event, they stepped out into the crisp night air. The city smelled of rain again, just as it had the night they met. Marco slipped his coat around her shoulders and murmured, "Do you ever think about that first night at the restaurant?" She laughed softly. "I think about how terrified I was to speak. And now I've learned that sometimes the most powerful voices don't use words at all." He smiled, his fingers entwining with hers. "Then we'll keep speaking in our own language, when only we understand." They walked together. Through the quiet streets, the city lights reflecting in puddles like tiny galaxies beneath their feet. Around them, the world continued its endless noise. But within that noise, they carried their silence as shared. Unbreakable harmony, and somewhere in a garden filled with lavender and laughter, Lucia watched from the window, her hands forming a simple phrase in sign language. Love found a voice. The sound of Forever Autumn arrived quietly, painting the DeLuca gardens in amber and crimson. The once vivid lavender had faded into pale violet ghosts, and the crisp scent of fallen leaves drifted through open windows. Lena often found herself standing on the terrace in the early mornings, breathing in the stillness that came before the household awoke. The world felt different, now steadier, warmer, as though every moment carried a purpose. The community center had become more than a project. It was a living dream. Children of every background gathered there each week, learning to express joy and sorrow with their hands. Lucia spent hours among them, her laughter soft and contagious, and beside her, Marco had transformed too. The restless energy that once cloaked him in quiet tension had been replaced with a calm determination that came from finally doing something that mattered. Asterisk for Alina, each day was a revelation. The girl who had once moved through the city invisible now stood before classrooms teaching others how to be seen, how to listen with their eyes. Yet with success came doubt, the uneasy question of what the future would demand in exchange for all this newfound peace. She had never sought permanence in the DeLuca mansion. She still kept her small apartment, repaired and modest, as a reminder of the path that had shaped her. But every time she left the estate, Lucia insisted she return soon, and every evening. Marco found a reason to visit the center before dinner, bringing her coffee or a stack of papers that needed her signature. Their partnership had grown into something both professional and deeply personal, connection woven from shared ideals. Quiet glances, and the unspoken understanding that love could exist without needing to be declared every day. One late afternoon, the sky turned the color of copper as a storm gathered above the horizon. Marco stood by the window of his office, staring at the first drops of rain. "My board is restless again," he said when Alina entered, shaking off her umbrella. "They think I'm losing focus because of the foundation. They want to cut funding for the language programs and push new contracts with the investors I've been avoiding." Alina frowned, setting her bag down. "You've changed too much for them to understand. But you can't build something meaningful if you're still chained to their expectations." He turned, his eyes tired but resolute. "That's what you always say, build something meaningful. You make it sound simple." "It's not simple," she replied gently, "but it's worth it. They see you as a businessman. I see the man who sits with deaf children and teaches them their first word in sign language. That's the Marco the world needs." Her words hit something deep in him, crossed the room and stopped only a breath away. "You make me believe in possibilities I didn't know existed. And you remind me that kindness isn't weakness," she said, her voice low. "It's the strongest language there is." They stood there for a long moment, the rain blurring the city outside, the thunder distant but steady. It was one of those moments when silence itself felt sacred. In the weeks that followed, the center's reputation grew rapidly. Journalists came to interview Lucia about her advocacy for the deaf community, and Elena's name began appearing in local papers as a young leader of change. With attention, however, came scrutiny. Old acquaintances from Elena's past began resurfacing, people from her university, who once dismissed her ambitions now eager to associate with her success. She accepted their congratulations politely but kept her distance. Her peace had been hard-earned. She wasn't about to trade it for admiration built on convenience. One evening, while reviewing lesson plans, she found an envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a letter written in careful script. "Miss Morales, you don't know me, but my daughter has been attending your classes at the center. She's 6 years old, born deaf, and until last month, she had never said mama in any language. Yesterday, she signed it for the first time. Thank you for giving my child a voice." Gratefully, Angela V. Alina read it twice, tears blurring the words. That night, she brought the letter to Marco. He read it in silence and then placed it carefully in a frame on his desk. "This," he said softly, "is why we fight for what we do. Not the buildings, not the headlines. This." From that day on, the framed letter became their reminder of purpose, a symbol that goodness could echo louder than power. Winter descended early that year, turning the DeLuca estate into a snow-covered haven. Lucia hosted small gatherings at the mansion, inviting families from the center to celebrate the holidays. The halls were filled with laughter and fluttering hands signing joy, gratitude, and togetherness. For Alina, it was the most beautiful, soundless symphony she had ever witnessed. During one of those evenings, as the firelight danced on the walls, Lucia took Elena's hands in hers and signed with deliberate tenderness, "You've brought music into our silence." Tears welled in Elena's eyes. She answered with shaking fingers, "And you gave me family when I had none." Marco watched them from across the room, his expression full of quiet pride. Later, when the guests had gone and Lucia had retired, he joined Alina by the fireplace. "You've changed her world," he murmured. "And mine." Elena smiled through the glow of the flames. "Maybe we just reminded each other what love looks like." He reached into his pocket and took out a small velvet box. "I was going to wait until New Year's," he said with a nervous laugh. "But my mother told me waiting is for people who doubt. I don't doubt anymore." When he opened the box, a delicate silver ring gleamed in the firelight, simple yet timeless. "Alina, I don't know what tomorrow holds, whether business will crumble or thrive, whether the world will approve or not. But I do know that life feels louder, brighter, truer with you in it. Will you stay? Not as my guest or my teacher, but as my partner in every language that exists." Her heart seemed to stop and then race at once. She had imagined many futures, but none so luminous as this. She nodded slowly, tears spilling freely. "Yes, Marco, in every language, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and in that moment the thunder outside softened into snow. Their kiss was not grand or cinematic. It was quiet, steady, and eternal, like the love that had grown between them from the simplest act of kindness. Months later, the community center expanded into 3 new branches across the city. The programs attracted educators from around the world. It's inspired by what the DeLuca Foundation called the Language of Hearts Initiative. Lucia continued to be its honorary chairwoman, often signing speeches that Alina translated to standing ovations. Reporters wrote about the once mysterious DeLuca heir who had traded steel towers for classrooms, and about the woman who had taught him that silence could heal. Yet despite all the success, their life remained beautifully ordinary. On quiet mornings, Alina would wake to find Marco already in the kitchen brewing coffee. His sleeves rolled up, his smile unguarded. They spent Sundays walking along the riverside markets, Lucia sometimes joining them with her cane and her ever-present humor. Evenings ended with laughter echoing through the halls, some spoken, some signed, all understood. One spring morning, a new sound filled their home, the faint cry of a newborn. Their daughter, Isabella, entered the world with dark hair and curious eyes. When the doctor gently mentioned that she might face partial hearing challenges, Alina only smiled through tears. "Then she'd grow up speaking the most beautiful language in the world," she whispered. Lucia cried openly, signing through trembling hands, "Another voice for our family's music." Years later, that little girl would stand beside her mother at the community center's annual celebration, her tiny hands signing to the audience with perfect grace. Marco would watch from the front row, his heart swelling with a pride no empire could ever match. On the 10th anniversary of the foundation, the city honored the DeLuca family with a civic award for humanitarian work. The event was held at La Bellera, the very restaurant where their story had begun. The chandeliers glowed softly above the polished tables, and as Alina stepped onto the small stage, the room fell silent. She looked at the faces before her, the students, the donors, the friends, and finally at Marco and Lucia, sitting together in the front row. Her voice was steady, but full of emotion. Years ago, I was a shy waitress, afraid to speak, afraid to be seen. One night I met a woman who reminded me that connection doesn't need sound. Her kindness changed my life, and her son's courage gave me faith in humanity again. Everything you see here was born from that one moment of understanding. She paused, smiling as her hands began to sign the final words while she spoke. Sometimes, the smallest gestures carry the loudest echoes. And if you ever doubt the power of kindness, remember love has a language all its own. The audience rose to its feet in applause, some clapping, others signing their approval. Marco joined her on stage, taking her hand as Lucia's eyes shone with pride. Together, they looked out at the sea of faces, united in silence and sound alike. Outside, the rain began to fall once more, soft and shimmering against the windows, just as it had that first night. But now, the rain was not a curtain of loneliness. It was a song, and its rhythm carried through the city, whispering of hope, of second chances, of voices found where none were expected, and in that harmony of hands and hearts, the shy waitress who once spoke only through gestures had become the storyteller. Of countless lives, proof that the truest miracles are born not from wealth or power, but from the courage to reach out and say, even without words, I see you. I hear you. You matter. Echoes of light years flowed gently through the DeLuca household, each season layering new memories upon the old. The mansion that had once echoed with quiet formality now resonated with laughter, learning, and the rhythmic melody of hand signing and conversation. Elena's foundation had grown far beyond anything she had imagined. The Language of Hearts initiative now spanned multiple countries. With schools and outreach programs across Europe and South America, families once trapped in silence were discovering communication for the first time. And in every photograph, plaque, and speech, one name appeared beside the project's emblem: Elena Morales DeLuca. The woman who had taught the world to listen differently. Lucia had grown frailer with age, but her spirit remained unshakable. She spent most mornings in her sunroom surrounded by plants, dictating letters of encouragement to students, and proudly watching her granddaughter. Isabella practiced new words in both spoken and sign language. The little girl had inherited her father's quiet focus and her mother's luminous empathy. When she laughed, it seemed as though the house itself sighed with contentment. Marco, meanwhile, had withdrawn from much of the corporate world, passing the day-to-day leadership of his companies to trusted partners. He preferred spending his time at the foundation, mentoring young entrepreneurs who wanted to blend business with compassion. He no longer measured wealth in balance sheets, but in lives changed, for Elena's success had never dulled her humility. Each night, she returned home with the same gratitude that had once carried her through the restaurant doors of La Bellera. Sometimes she and Marco would revisit that place now, under new management, and sit at table 11, reminiscing about the night that changed everything. She still remembered how her hands had trembled when she first signed to Lucia, how she had felt the eyes of strangers upon her, and how one act of kindness had rewritten her destiny. Whenever young volunteers asked her how the movement began, she smiled and said, with a conversation made of silence and understanding, it was during one of those quiet evenings at home, long after Isabella had fallen asleep, that Elena found Marco gazing at the city lights from their balcony. The years had etched faint lines at the corners of his eyes, but his presence still carried the same calm gravity that had once made her nervous. She stepped beside him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "You're awake late again," she murmured. He smiled faintly. "Old habits. The city looks different at night. Less noise, more truth." She followed his gaze. "What truth are you looking for tonight?" "The kind that reminds me none of this was coincidence," he said quietly. "If my mother hadn't insisted on dinner that night, if you hadn't chosen to answer her in sign language, If you turned away instead of staying, everything that followed would never have existed. He turned toward her, his expression softening. Sometimes I think fate is just kindness meeting courage at the right moment. Alina touched his arm gently. And sometimes fate is a man who learned to listen to silence. They stood in that golden glow for a long while, the hum of the city like a lullaby beneath them. Marco reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch, the kind used for jewelry. From it, he drew a thin silver bracelet, engraved with a single phrase in Italian dove, L'Iparo non arrivano, il cuore parla. Where words fail, the heart speaks. I had this made for you, he said. It's the motto of our new school in Florence. I thought it belonged first to the woman who inspired it. Elena traced the engraving with her fingers, her eyes misting. You still surprise me after all these years, he chuckled softly. Then I'm doing something right. That winter, however, brought shadows they could not control. Lucia's health began to decline rapidly, her once steady hands trembling when she tried to sign. Doctors spoke in careful tones about the limits of treatment. The news struck them all, but it was Alina who refused despair. She spent hours by Lucia's bedside, reading aloud, translating the world into gestures that comforted rather than reminded of loss. Some evenings, the old woman would sign slowly, Promise me the center will continue after I'm gone. Promise me our language will live longer than my name. With tears in her eyes, Alina always answered, It already does, Mama Lucia. It lives in everyone who learns to understand without hearing. On the night Lucia passed, the house was silent, except for the whisper of rain against the windows. The same kind of rain that had once introduced them all to one another. Alina held her hand until the very end, feeling the warmth fade gently, like the closing of a beloved book. Marco, though devastated, remained composed for his family's sake, drawing strength from the woman beside him, who had once taught him that love could outlast loss. The funeral was held in the garden Lucia had tended for decades. Friends, students, and families gathered among rows of lavender, each person raising their hands toward the sky and signing the word for thank you. No speeches were needed. The collective silence spoke louder than any sermon. When the ceremony ended, Lena felt a small hand slip into hers, Isabella's, and she realized that grief and hope could coexist, intertwined like vines climbing the same wall in the months that followed. Marco and Alina poured their hearts into honoring Lucia's legacy. They established the Lucia De Luca Academy, a global training institute for inclusive communication. Scholars from every continent came to study there, and its opening ceremony was broadcast worldwide. Standing on the grand stage, Alina addressed the audience with steady voice and graceful hands, speaking both aloud and in sign, a seamless duet of sound and motion. We were taught, she said, that silence is emptiness. But silence is full of stories waiting for someone patient enough to listen. My mother-in-law believed that if even one person learns to listen differently, the world changes a little. Today, we continue that belief. This academy is not just a building. It's a promise that no voice, spoken or unspoken, will ever be left behind. The applause that followed felt like thunder softened by reverence. In that moment, Marco looked at her with the same awe he had felt the first night they met. The years had deepened his respect into something unshakable. She wasn't just his wife or partner, but the embodiment of the hope his mother had carried all her life. Later, as they walked through the corridors of the newly opened academy, Alina stopped beside a mural depicting hands reaching toward a rising sun. She would have loved this, she whispered. Marco nodded. She does love it. Somewhere beyond words, she's watching. He turned to her then, eyes shining with quiet pride. You know, when people ask me what the most powerful thing in the world is, I tell them it isn't money or influence. It's compassion. You proved that, Alina. You changed an empire built on silence into a family built on understanding. She smiled, her fingers brushing his. And you gave that compassion a place to grow. Years passed once more, and the world continued to evolve around them. Technology advanced, cities rose higher, and societies grew louder. Yet within that noise, the language of hearts remained constant. Taught in schools, practiced in homes, embedded in digital learning systems across the globe, the movement had become more than education. It was a philosophy: to lead with empathy, to see before judging, to listen before speaking. On the 20th anniversary of the foundation, the DeLucas returned to Chicago for a commemorative event at La Bellera. The restaurant had been restored to its former elegance, and the manager, recognizing them instantly, insisted they sit once again at table 11. As Alina ran her fingers along the smooth wood, she felt a rush of nostalgia: the frightened waitress, the commanding stranger, the gentle mother who had smiled across the table, all of them still alive in memory. During the celebration, Isabella, now a poised young woman, took the stage to speak. Her voice was clear, her signing flawless. "My grandmother taught me that silence is never the absence of sound. It is the presence of meaning. My parents taught me that kindness can rewrite history. Everything you see here exists because one woman refused to stay invisible." She turned toward Alina and smiled. "Mama, this story started with you." Tears glistened in Elena's eyes as the audience rose, their hands moving in applause, the sign for love and gratitude lighting the room like fireflies. Marco slipped his arm around her shoulders, whispering, "Looks like the shy waitress became the voice of a generation." She laughed softly, wiping her tears. "No, Marco, we all did. Together." That night, after the guests departed, they walked through the quiet streets of the city. The air smelled of rain again, gentle and familiar. As they passed the riverfront, Marco stopped and looked up at the skyline. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Alina tilted her head, smiling. "The rain?" "No," he said. "The world? It's quieter now," she understood. Quieter, not in sound, but in soul. Less noise. More meaning. They stood there hand in hand, the reflections of city lights shimmering on the water. And for a moment the years between past and present dissolved. All that remained was the echo of their beginning, a young woman's trembling hands, a mother's grateful smile, and a man learning, finally, to listen, and somewhere beyond the city's pulse. In the rhythm of raindrops and the hush of twilight, their story whispered its final truth: that love, once spoken in the language of hearts, never truly ends. It simply changes form, echoing through generations like light carried forward through the hands of time, the legacy within silence decades later. The DeLuca name had come to mean something entirely different from what it once represented. No longer whispered in corridors of power or traced through the ledgers of business empires, it now appeared in classrooms, libraries, and hospitals across continents. The Language of Hearts initiative had evolved into a global movement, its logo two interlocked hands, forming the shape of a heart recognized as a symbol of understanding that transcended words. From bustling cities to quiet mountain villages, children learned to greet each other in sign language, not as a novelty, but as an expression of respect. Governments adopted the foundation's curriculum, and universities invited Alina Luca to lecture about the psychology of empathy and the evolution of human communication. She declined most invitations, preferring the quiet of her work to applause, but when she did appear, audiences described the experience as being in the presence of calm, light, humility made visible by then. Marco had retired completely from corporate life. He spent his mornings in the garden that had once belonged to his mother, tending to the same lavender rose that still bloomed faithfully every spring. The smell of those blossoms brought memories of Lucia, her laughter, her wisdom, her fierce belief that love was a language of its own. He often found Alina sitting nearby under the old oak tree, notebook on her lap, sketching ideas for new programs. Even after all those years, he still marveled at how her presence softened the world. She was no longer the shy waitress who once hid behind serving trays. She had become the quiet architect of human connection. Their daughter, Isabella, now 30, directed the Foundation's international wing. Fluent in 6 spoken languages and 3 sign systems, she carried her mother's gentle patience and her father's strategic mind. Where Alina built bridges, Isabella strengthened them. Together, The 3 generations of DeLucas had turned what began as a single act of kindness into a legacy that touched millions. One bright morning in Florence, the family gathered for the unveiling of the Lucia DeLuca Memorial Hall, an extension of the original academy. The hall's design was a masterpiece of light high arched, its windows filtering sunbeams into patterns that resembled moving hands. At the ceremony, Isabella spoke first, her voice confident yet tender. "This hall is not built of stone and glass," she said. "It is built of stories of every student who learned to express joy without fear, of every mother who heard her child's laughter through touch, and of every soul who realized that silence can be love's truest instrument." Asterisk when applause filled the air. Alina felt the same overwhelming gratitude she had felt the day she first spoke to Lucia. Her life, she realized, had come full circle, from serving tables to serving humanity, from silence born of fear to silence born of peace. After the event, she slipped away for a moment to stand by the bronze statue of Lucia that graced the courtyard. The sculptor had captured her perfectly hands mid-sign, eyes full of warmth. Alina rested her palm on the cool metal and whispered, "You see, Mama Lucia." The world listened, after all. Later that evening, as the crowd dispersed and twilight settled over Florence, Marco joined her on a balcony overlooking the city. Below them, the Arno River glimmered under strings of lantern light. The distant hum of laughter carried through the streets. "Do you ever wonder," he asked softly, "how different everything might have been if we hadn't met that night?" Alina smiled, her eyes reflecting the fading sun. "I used to. But then I realized life isn't about the path we take. It's about the courage to stop running when kindness calls." He turned to her, admiration written in every line of his face. "You've always believed that love can change the world. I used to think it was naive. Now I know it's the only thing that ever does." Asterisk, they fell into comfortable silence, the kind that needed no translation. Below them, music drifted from a nearby plaza where students from the academy were performing. Some played violins. Others translated the melodies through expressive sign, turning rhythm into motion. Alina watched them, tears welling again. "Look at them," she whispered. "Every note, every gesture, it's her dream alive." Marco took her hand gently. "It's our dream, Alina, and it's still growing."